We're actually at an inflection point, I think, in the national security policy making world around crypto. Now in 2025, we're at a very different period because there's a new playbook that's happening, I think. We're seeing signals of the US considering, well, how can we go beyond just risk mitigation, risk management, and illicit finance prevention? How can we use this technology?
Hello and welcome to Public Key. I'm your returning host, Eitan Danon. Today I get the pleasure of speaking with Yaya, the Director of Policy for AML and Cyber Risk at the Crypto Council for Innovation, about the multifaceted dynamics of cryptocurrencies and their implications for national security, illicit finance, and global policymaking. Yaya leverages his rich background in intelligence analysis to discuss the widespread impact of blockchain technology on economic security and policy, including the response of various governments to illicit finance threats and the integration of innovative tech in mitigating financial crime. Listeners will gain an understanding of strategies from countries like China and Iran, and the learnings into how digital assets are shaping the geopolitical landscape. Before we jump into the episode, did you miss out on our flagship event, Links, which took place last week in the heart of New York City? Don't stress, Chainalysis provides you exclusive access to the free Links virtual event. You'll have access to multiple live showings to accommodate global time zones, or register to watch on demand at your convenience, where you will get insights from Chainalysis CEO Jonathan Levin on the crypto landscape, and exclusive insights on global policy trends to see expert-led solution demos covering innovations on blockchain investigations, compliance, fraud prevention, and Web3 security. Head down to the show notes now to register and secure your spot. Now, on to our episode. I'm here today with my friend Yaya, who's the Director of Policy for AML and Cyber Risk at the Crypto Council for Innovation. Welcome to the pod, Yaya.
Hey, Tan, thank you for inviting me. Glad to be here.
Really looking forward to the conversation. So before we get started, walk our listeners through a little bit of your professional background and how you arrived at the crypto space. What has your journey been like?
Well, my journey has been a circuitous route in many ways, but professionally, probably what's most important to your listeners is I used to work in the U.S. intelligence community. I was at CIA, where I was an analyst, and I was there these are early days for me in my career, 2005 to 2012. And I worked in a variety of areas. I was hired as an economic analyst. I actually focused on economic issues in sub-Saharan Africa. That was what I was hired for. Soon, I went on to become mostly a counterterrorism analyst. I was assigned to the National Counterterrorism Center and worked on, these were the days of peak Al-Qaeda. So, the 2000s, spent some time. I did a 3-month deployment to Afghanistan during that time. But I focused on CT, as we call it, counterterrorism, for the bulk of my time. And I didn't do anything with technology per se, and I wasn't looking at terrorist financing so much. I was just looking at overall plotting. And I didn't know back then anything about Bitcoin or crypto. It wasn't on my radar, just me personally. Some people might say, oh, it wasn't the CIA behind Bitcoin?
I love a good conspiracy theory.
Yeah, you're not going to get any of that here from me. So,
right.
But interestingly, I left government for a few years and I wound up working in the DC national security think tank space. So outside of government, I was working at an organization called the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and there was a center called the Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance. Why am I saying all of this? The main point was my task was to focus on economic security and national security, so economic issues. And I was actually kind of new, I was new to the think tank world. I was just sort of finding my place, now writing articles for the public as opposed to, classified reports, etc. And I was just thinking about, well, what are the threats? What are the trends that we should be on the lookout for so that we could write about, so that we could, talk to policymakers? And in 2015, I learned about Bitcoin. Maybe I'd heard about it, but in 2015, I kind of looked into it and was wondering about it. This was when ISIS was big, right? In 2015. So I remember seeing some headlines or some brief articles saying that terrorists are going to use Bitcoin, or terrorists are using Bitcoin, or are using crypto. And it was never substantiated. This was all in the press. So being you can take an analyst out of the CIA, but you can't take the CIA out of the analyst, right? I was thinking, well, how could we substantiate that? I can't just take these rumors and, these headlines which say, bad actors are going to use crypto or terrorists are going to use it. I said, well, what do we actually know? What can we study? So I just sort of kept that inquiry in my back pocket. I said, yeah, that's interesting. We should look at this. What if we do find terrorists using it? And for about almost a year, it was in my back pocket. I kind of just sort of left it alone, didn't think about it. 2016 rolls around. And in 2016, I'll never forget. It was the summer of 2016, and I'm sitting in my office, and across my desk comes a press report saying that one particular terrorist group, or this sort of consortium of jihadist groups, was fundraising on Twitter. This was the
Ibn Taymiyyah Media Center?
Yeah, Ibn Taymiyyah Media Center, right? And they were the Mujahideen Shura Council, right? And so the news flash was that, hey, they were on social media, they were soliciting Bitcoin.
It's one of our oldest blog posts, I think, at Chainalysis.
It probably is, because there's even some backstory there. So maybe put a pin in that. And
maybe we can come back to that.
Come back to how some conversations I had with these two guys named Michael and Jonathan back in 2016. So let's put a hold on that. But anyway, so lo and behold, I saw the news report, didn't think too much of it. I said, is this another one of those news reports, saying terrorists might use Bitcoin? So I went away to lunch, but before I did, I told my two interns, I said, hey, look into this media report. Let's look at it, see if there's anything there, and then tell me what you get when I come back. I come back, and my interns say, well, we found the Twitter post, and we scanned the QR code that they were soliciting on Twitter. We found it, and we see blockchain.info. Here's where they're raising Bitcoin. And this was, for me, this was the moment. This was a seminal moment for me. I said, whoa, wait a second. Wait, so this group, which we can pretty much verify, they're the ones using the social media handle. We know it's them. They have a history, etc. So wait, you're saying they're raising Bitcoin, and here is the Bitcoin? Like, this is, what is this, the address thing? And they said, yeah, this is. And I said, well, have they raised any money? And cue the beginning of my foray into the world.
The rest is history.
Rest is history. Yep. That's how I started looking at crypto and illicit finance.
That's great. That's a wonderful story arc. And we've certainly, as an industry and ecosystem, I think, not only blockchain analytics, come quite a long way from that point. Yeah. I want to expand the aperture a little bit, beyond just terrorism. A lot of our research focuses on geopolitics and national security, and I would love to get your take on crypto's evolving role in the context of NatSec. There's a lot of hot takes, lots of provocative, let's call them, talking points. What do you see as some of the major risks and benefits for governments when it comes to crypto being used for illicit finance?
Well, we're actually at an inflection point, I think, in the national security policy making world around crypto. And this has been quite an evolution, because back in those days, again, going a little bit back to the 2016 era, 2017, where the conversation was purely how are illicit actors, national security threat actors, how are they using crypto? How might they use it? That was the initial thing. First, terrorist groups, and then other groups, sort of North Korea sort of came on the radar a little bit later. But the posture or the tone of these conversations was always, how do we stop these bad guys from using it against us or gaining funds from it so that they can do things against the United States, And so that was the tone of the conversation. Now, as the years went by, policymakers started to look at what state actors started to do, which was not always just stealing crypto or hacking crypto, but using crypto themselves, mining crypto themselves, if you're talking about Iran in particular and North Korea, hacking exchanges. And then there started to be a discussion about, well, will these state actors, state adversaries use blockchain technology itself? Will they try to create their own tokens? Cue Venezuela, what happened in like 2018 and 2019, which is something I looked closely at. They launched what they called the Petro, which was
Petro, right?
The Petro, right? It was, really, you look back and it's like, forget the, it's funny, when Libra came up, not Libra, Facebook Libra, the new Libra of 2025.
Javier Milei, right?
Exactly.
Right.
I sort of had flashbacks. I'm not saying it's the same sort of thing, but I was like, a government
just... Haven't I heard this before? Right.
Yeah, we're going to launch this token and it's going to pay all of our bills. I was like, sounds like Maduro. And
the IMF begs to differ.
Exactly. But getting to your question about the evolution, now in 2025, we're at a very different period because there's a new playbook that's happening, I think, and it comes from what we see in the new administration, even though it's sort of, brand spanking new, the Trump 2.0 administration, is the new playbook is on the U.S. side. We're seeing signals of the U.S. considering, well, how can we go beyond just risk mitigation, risk management, and illicit finance prevention? How can we use this technology? How can we, whether you use the term, be the crypto capital, but how can we leverage the technology? Now, and here's the thing, after years of following and tracking adversaries dealing with crypto, like this is actually what they did strategically. So a lot of state actors, even with Russia, when crypto first got on the political radar, it was, okay, this crypto stuff is bad. We got to,
let's crack down on this.
Let's crack down on it. Same thing in Iran, another good case, right? What is this crypto stuff? Pretty soon you see mining happening in Iran. You see Iran leveraging crypto. You see a whole growth of looking into blockchain technology and crypto. It's becoming, these governments saw that, well, you know what? This stuff is here. Why don't we use it to our advantage. And yeah, that may mean it helps us against our adversary. So what's happening now in the United States in recent years? I mean, not to get political or anything, but just in terms of stating the fact. Yeah, and actually all previous administrations up until now, right? The Trump administration, the first one, and then the Biden administration really intensified was this illicit finance prevention focus. Like crypto is bad. And you saw that a lot in the previous administration. So now we're seeing this shift, even if some of it is rhetorical, but we're seeing a tone, which is, let's think about how we could use this technology to our strategic advantage economically. And that's a shift. I think the page there hasn't been written. So, I mean, we're still looking at what this means, but I think there's a different approach that we're seeing coming out of the government now.
Awesome. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be monitored and analyzed, but certainly an important dynamic. So a few weeks ago, we released our flagship publication, the Crypto Crime Report for 2025. We analyzed the illicit finance nexus to crypto, everything and anything from ransomware and sanctions evasion to organized crime, extremism, and beyond. Given your policy experience and focus, it would be great to get your take on how you see governments around the world responding to the challenge of illicit finance on chain. I mean, you mentioned a few cases just now. Russia is about face. Iran, you've done a ton of research on China. It would be great for our listeners to get, if there is a TLDR on that, but I think that probably begs additional analysis and more insight than just a TLDR. And are there specific countries you see leading the way or cracking down and kind of unintended consequences? How do you see this landscape?
Yeah, there's a lot to say there. And I'll have to admit, my sort of caveat with everything, right, is my visibility is limited, right? I'm no longer in government. It may not even be on the pulse of certain developments that could be happening. So, right, I may see things from afar. But one thing that I do notice, maybe a couple of things. So one is, especially since I've been looking at this for, almost 10 years now, probably the big thing that has changed has been the sort of expertise that we see governments have. And not just the big countries that you've named. I mean, probably the biggest issue is that most countries in the world, crypto is still something very new that they're trying to get a handle on. So from a regulatory perspective, but also from a financial crime prevention perspective. And I remember 6-7 years ago, I did a briefing at National Defense University. And this was when I was doing a lot of briefings in the 2017-18 period about what is this crypto? What is Bitcoin? What is crypto? What are some of the illicit finance risks? What are people doing? And I'll never forget and it was the audience it wasn't just military, it was financial intelligence unit officials from various countries and other law enforcement officials. And one guy from Ghana came up to me afterwards, and he's from the FIU, and he was like their cyber guy, right? So this is the guy who's dealing with cyber. And he comes to me and he says, Mr. Fanusi, we're just getting a handle on XYZ. Now you're bringing this crypto stuff.
You just doubled my portfolio. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. And that was years ago, right? And I said, I'm sorry, but this is what you have to be aware of. Now, years later, countries like Ghana, countries in sub-Saharan Africa and all over the world sort of have a sense of what the tools are, that this is, there's still gaps, obviously. And this is probably the biggest thing that, international bodies like the Financial Action Task Force, which, oversees and sets standards for AML and CFT, those organizations are seeing that countries need the tools. So expertise, tools, technology, those are the things that I think are much more prevalent now. It's difficult to say is setting themselves apart, but I will say this. This is something to look at. When crypto is global, right? Crypto is global. It doesn't really have borders. So what you find, just look at some of the press releases every time you see a big bust of some sort of, cyber operation that involves crypto, whether it's any illicit finance operation, could be connected to a whole bunch of different illicit areas. You often will see that these are international joint operations where jurisdictions are working together. So, Europol might announce something and but it's not just Europe. It might be European agencies with the United States, with Australia, in the US, right? You often see, when there's an international case, right? These targets are brought down because of cooperation. I think that's probably the biggest thing that I would say the successful countries are doing is they're not addressing illicit finance within a silo of, okay, our agency has to tackle this. It's all through joint operations, working with task forces, learning, getting training. So that's probably be the key because you can leverage other partners a lot more than just trying to attack things through your own borders alone.
Great. Well, on the innovation front, like the countries that are doing more and some of the risk that comes along with that, one of the many things you look at is tech and regulatory innovations, and two sides of the coin. What are some of those innovations that you see emerging to mitigate risks of misuse by crypto? From our angle, we recently acquired Hexagate and Alteria, which are two cutting-edge Web3 companies. The first focusing on post-hacks and exploits. The second one leverages AI AI to look at scams, prevent scams, both of them heavily focused on prevention. So not just responding to illicit activity, but the full life cycle of investigations, risk mitigation, and prevention. How do you think policymakers can strike a balance between promoting innovation, the climate in the US that we have right now and globally, some of these tailwinds, and protecting consumers, protecting national security? People always say there's a great tension between the two, but can the needle be threaded?
Yeah, it's tough to thread that needle, or it's very tough because the tensions between innovation, privacy, and illicit finance are big. I think what I'm seeing is two parallel innovation tracks, and it's what we see happening within industry and also what we see government thinking about. Now, the things I'm going to mention, some of them are more on the frontier side of things. Like you've mentioned things which are running now, and obviously you bought certain companies because their tools are out in the field. But I think what I would point people to is a different parallel track of innovation happening to mitigate illicit finance. So what are those two tracks? One is, I think, what industry is already doing within the crypto industry, specifically to keep illicit actors from their platforms. Last year at Crypto Council for Innovation, we released a crypto illicit finance risk management guide. And it's basically a one-pager, and it shows all the different things that industry is doing or can do to stop illicit activity or try to hinder illicit activity. And some of it is just your basic, you start with centralized exchanges and what they're already doing with just AML compliance overall, right? But once you get more into the decentralized space and decentralized applications and protocols, you get more into some of the cryptographic tools that are being experimented upon, right? I mean, your listeners will have heard about zero knowledge proofs, I'm sure plenty, right? That's just one example of a cryptographic tool that, is sort of frontier, which is being experimented upon, a lot of pilots and research. But those types of things are things that can be built within crypto ecosystems, blockchain ecosystems, to try to have some level of, if it's not compliance per se, it is mitigating risk and other things. There are different cryptographic tools which are used to try to associate certain qualities. So you could do that in a decentralized protocol to sort of segregate certain types of funds from another.
Providing an AML check without giving up PII, something like that.
Yeah, right. So you have all of that going on. So a lot of that stuff is being researched or is being worked on, even by industry, right? Startups are doing. So I think that's key. I think we'll probably come back to that because that frontier space relates to how do we keep privacy in a more digital environment, in a digital finance environment. That honestly, to me, is like the theme I would want to leave people with, which is finance is getting more digital. We're using different systems. We're using different technology to transact. So in that environment, we're going to have ways to preserve privacy. This is not just the ultra libertarian or anarchist, who's just like, I don't want, this is going to touch
It's a practical question around how to scale it. How does this scale? Right?
Exactly. I'll put that as one thing, but then there's the other thing, which is also just being talked about in policy circles. I'm not saying I'm endorsing it, but here's a concept that people are talking about, which is embedded supervision. Embedded supervision is the idea that you can take these protocols, and then what you could do is you could actually insert regulatory compliance within smart contracts to help with the monitoring, to help with compliance. Now, who's thinking about this? Obviously, the regulators are thinking about this. This is happening a lot in Europe. But that's the idea of, hey, people see this technology, they see the innovation possible, and people are trying to figure out how can we use these systems to help police them and to keep illicit activity outside of them.
Those are great suggestions, and I encourage listeners to give both of those things a Google. I think not only on CCI's website, but lots to chew on there. So I want to hyperlink back to something we touched on briefly, and you mentioned pilots now, which made the synapse fire in my brain. So China is advancing its CBDC, the digital yuan, right? The ECNY.
Yeah.
You have done a ton of research on China and are very outspoken and knowledgeable about digital finance, technology writ large, but certainly digital assets in the People's Republic of China. We had Matt Pines on the pod a few weeks ago from Sentinel One to talk about how the different pieces fit together. He's done a lot of research on what he calls their techno-authoritarian tech stack, or, everyone has their own nomenclature, but it would be great to get your take on how you see the ECNY impacting not only global crypto markets, but kind of on the geopolitical front. We've had China evolve from a full ban, on permissionless things to robust adoption on permissioned networks. And now we see in our Geos report last year, China coming up in the top 20, very active, lots going on, more than would meet the eye. And so enter someone like Yaya to help our listeners break it down.
Yeah, well, the ECNY, there are a few different sides to it. Maybe your initial question about, well, how will the ECNY impact crypto globally, crypto markets, etc. For that, I would say very little, because the ECNY, that's China's CBDC, and it's a retail, it's being used for domestic person consumer payments.
Not central bank to central bank for the most part.
Yes, for the most part. Now, we'll get to that central bank part, but the pilot is mainly focused on that. And it has a very small footprint even now, right? It's been a couple of years and they're slowly doing it. There's really no rush. I mean, right? I think for the People's Bank of China, their central bank, they're doing this for research. They're trying to see how it works. They're probably fine tuning it. I mean, there's no rush, right? They can just kind of let this out. It really has a domestic focus. But there is an international component to what China is doing around CBDCs that I think the US in particular needs to pay attention to, which is China is using its success or its progress with CBDCs to coordinate and collaborate with other countries to develop international cross-border payments of wholesale CBDC transactions. So to break that down, what I'm talking about is, for one, there's a pilot project called mBridge. And mBridge, in a snapshot, right, it's a cross-border blockchain-based platform where a few central banks, including China's central bank and a few other countries, are experimenting with facilitating big transactions cross-border. So if you're in Thailand and you want to trade with someone in the UAE, you go to this platform and then you're able to do a big transaction. Now, the thing is, what are the implications? Well, this is really, in a pilot form, it's a substitute for using the correspondent banking system. If there's a transaction between Thailand and the United Arab Emirates, I don't have to necessarily go to a bank to look for dollars to facilitate that transaction because the dollar is more liquid and and most banks have dollars. No, instead, I go to this platform and the platform just does like their own atomic swap between your currency and their currency in a CBDC form. Now you've simplified the cross-border trade process. Now, this right now, it's a pilot, and it was under the Bank for International Settlements. Now it's gone on its own. The BIS, as it's called, has sort of removed itself. Now, I think it's going to be really driven by China. So the implication there is that you have other countries, friends and foe, right? It's not just China doing this. Other countries are trying to figure out a more efficient way to do cross-border transactions. They've learned from crypto. If people wonder, like, how has crypto influenced central banks? Crypto has spurred them to consider innovating a little bit more. CBDCs, whether you like them or don't, they're a sign of innovation. So the big implications there are, wow, if there's a viable alternative for cross-border payments, then the U.S. has maybe the potential to lose some of its sanctions prowess, its potency, and economic statecraft. U.S. economic statecraft relies on U.S. strength within the financial system, and this could undermine it.
Certainly, mBridge and a lot of these dynamics seem to be coming up more and more. And certainly on a lot of the episodes, I've been hosting and asking this question. So thank you for that. What about interoperability? China is not afraid of embracing emerging technology, certainly on the AI front, hardware, software, and otherwise. They are full steam ahead. Quantum research, you name it. And, at Chainalysis, we view blockchain and crypto as one of several critical emerging technologies in this great conversation. Can you help our listeners situate, perhaps, digital assets in the PRC against the broader backdrop of emerging technology?
Well, the way to look at it, I'm glad you framed it that way, because what's happening with China around CBDC, digital assets, and fintech in general, it's not about money. It's not about currency. It's about data.
Data, right?
It's all about the data. I mean, as I say, it's not about the Benjamins. It's all about the data. Right. I mean, just look at it, and you can peel back the layers.
We had Yusuf Al-Otaiba saying data is the new oil, right? Yeah. Everyone gets up and says that, but I think
but
it is the most valuable asset of the 21st century.
Well, I have another sort of saying for you. I say data is the new electricity, not oil. And I say electricity. Why? Because all of our devices, everything we use, all of the appliances, they're powered by electricity. I kind of think data is going to power, and what powers devices, platforms, AI, right? AI is nothing without data, big data.
Right.
And the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party saw this years ago. In fact, there's a great RAND report. It's about China and big data analysis. And it's maybe from 2020, I think. But it looks back in the previous years, and it says that you see all these statements coming from the Chinese Communist Party saying we need to focus on data. We need to build big data, data analytics. And artificial intelligence is really just the step from that, right? That if you have data, if you're able to analyze it, you can leverage it in smart ways. You could build smart smarter systems. So, of course, one corollary here is what happens to finance. Then you want a more data-based finance. And it's not just you want data, but the Chinese government's way is, well, the state should control the data. The state should make use of it for the state's interest, whatever the state wants to do. So you should have a system where data comes to you. Data is collected. Data is aggregated and analyzed. And that's really the framing of what China is doing. It's not about money. It's not even about, making the yuan be more attractive than the dollar. That's not the game that they're playing. They're actually playing a game that I think they would assess that the U.S. has been asleep at the wheel in terms of with digital finance and organizing a system so that you're able to leverage data. The U.S. doesn't have that sort of vision or plan, right? We're not a centralized authoritarian state, so we can't just have one from up top ordering the entire economy to act in a certain way, right? We don't have a command economy like that. So the data-driven or data-focused economy is what's driving all of this. And digital assets, really, they fit into that. Because if you're going to have an economy that is programmable, that is always on, right, can be transparent, whether it's transparent to all the people or it's transparent to certain people that want to manage it, digital assets, blockchain technology enable that. So I think that's where, getting back to our initial question, I actually think that understanding may be coming to the US now, because again, before it wasn't so clear. A lot of people just sort of dismissed crypto. Oh, crypto is just this terrible stuff. Now people are saying, well, you know what? This technology makes sense and crypto may bring something that we need. The question is, how do we want to use it?
How do we harness its potential rather than adopting what you described as more of a threat-centric analytic paradigm, kind of embracing the potential? Well, you mentioned, the correspondent banking system, the plumbing of the dollar-denominated international financial system. You at the CCI, and I think in general, you spend a lot of your time thinking about AML and the practical implications. Going into TradFi a little bit, from your vantage point, how has the rise of crypto played into TradFi's evolving, let's call it, position, especially compliance-wise, monitoring, AML enforcement? What do you see as the main dynamics that our listeners should be paying attention to in the year and in the years ahead?
Yeah. I mean, if you're talking about the private banks, one thing, I'm not trying to say bad things about certain industries, whatever. I mean, the challenging thing...
Disclaimer is on its way.
I mean, the only thing I would say is it's unfortunate that the private, in TradFi, traditional finance, you see the private banks really playing catch up. I mean, it's funny. It's like central banks, who you expect to be the least innovative and the most behind. Central banks actually took the first lessons.
Let's get a sandbox going.
Hey, let's do X, Y, Z. Let's learn about it. I mean, 2014, the Bank of England put out a paper about Bitcoin and this technology, right? Way back then.
Not what you would expect.
What you would expect. And I've witnessed in the private banking, I mean, again, a lot of them would say that they have their hands tied behind the bank because of regulators, because of lack of certainty, right? So I'm not, but if anything, though, if I would say in terms of how are they learning, benefiting, I think with crypto is opening up everyone to a different, a new data source and even a new way to look at or think about, what's possible in terms of transactions. It's interesting. I mean, I saw recently a set of banking trade associations, right? Bank lobbying groups recently put out a letter to, where did the letter go to? Did it go to Treasury? But it was an open letter because I saw the letter urging regulators to allow them to basically deal with crypto. And this is as of last week. This is very recent. And actually making arguments that the crypto industry had been making about, if we don't sort of take off these onerous restrictions,
we will miss out unless you allow us to partake.
Yeah, so the banks are licking their chops, right?
We need to find alpha, but you need to let us do it without our hands tied behind our backs.
Exactly. Right? So what happens when you start looking at crypto? When you get into crypto, so even if you're traditional finance, it does open up things. I mean, I think it opens up you to think more about using data analytics, maybe more. I mean, obviously data analytics is being used now in compliance, but I think crypto, because it's so database analytically based, there's just a certain greater proficiency. It's going to force you to start thinking more about data. I think it's going to have you think more about AI if you're not already, just because it is the finance of the internet, right? It is the native finance of the internet. So if you're a TradFi, you're trying to think, how can I kind of work in this, even if I'm not dealing with crypto directly, how can I bridge that gap?
Absolutely. There's a lot to chew on there. I think at Chainalysis, we spend a lot of time thinking about these kind of complex questions and how our solutions and data can shed light on big data type questions. How can we leverage this to anticipate and predict and prevent? But certainly a lot there. I want to pivot back to the conflict zone. So we have and continue to research, we're analyzing crypto and its use by groups that are active in a range of conflict zones. We had the surprise implosion of the Assad regime in December, certainly the events of the past year, Hamas and the Iran-Israel and proxy war across the Middle East. We've put out quite a bit of content on Ukraine, used by pro-Russian militias who are fighting in Russia's war on Ukraine. How do you see these use cases impacting the prospects for adoption and for regulation? I think you, more than most and more than many, have the perspective not only on the NatSec front, but on the regulatory and policymaker thinking pulse. I know you said you don't have your finger exactly on the pulse, but I think you know a thing or two. So how do you see those pieces fitting together? Do you think, the naysayers will take these use cases and say, well, I told you so, this is for pro-Russian militias, this is to undermine the role of the dollar, et cetera, et cetera? Or can we say, well, I remember in Ukraine, Vitalik, he went on Twitter and said, I used, this was after the tornado designation, but I used this to make a donation. How do you see this?
Yeah, to say that all of these examples are just, proof of the illicit activity or the downside. You would only say that if you got one eye closed,
right.
You're trying to
selective reasoning.
Yeah, it's very selective. Honestly, there's a bit of a blossoming on all sides, right? Again, necessity is the mother of innovation, right? Invention, maybe it's the mother of innovation as well, right? I think about innovation. Necessity is the mother of innovation. There's a new. Can I trademark that?
Sure. Lots of quotable quotes on this episode, right?
Yeah, honestly, because if you think about it, right, what do folks who are in need, what do they do, right? They're thinking of what's the best use. How can they adapt to a bad situation? What can they take in limited resources? And yeah, you saw that with Russia, Ukraine, right? The first thing you saw with crypto was people doing fundraising to send to Ukraine, right? That was quicker than if you had done just a traditional TradFi
Western Union, right?
Exactly. Even GoFundMe or something, right? This was like just instant, come from all over the world. And so you're going to see examples like that in any conflict, right? The bad guys or the adversaries are going to be, trying to fundraise or launder through crypto. And then an NGO, a non-governmental organization, a charitable organization that's trying to do something for humanitarian aid is also going to try to figure out, how can we use stablecoins or how can we use crypto, to get to people that need it? You have all of that happening, simultaneously. So I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I would say that probably always going to be room for the gray area, gray markets. You're going to have, I think, the regulated space grow, meaning that more places are going to be regulated, more sort of institutional acceptance of the technology, right? Because there's a bottom line benefit of doing it. But you're always also, unfortunately, or just as a matter of fact, you're going to have unregulated spaces. That doesn't go away because it hasn't gone away in our traditional modes of finance either. So you're going to have it, and I think the challenge for law enforcement is going to be, okay, well, how do you accept that reality, and then how do you address it? Because you have to go for the illicit activity in both spaces.
Right.
There's illicit activity.
Every time a GSIB or a giant bank is fined to the tune of millions or even more, we don't point the finger to say, haha, but I think in the crypto space, and there's no shortage of hacks and incidents and the like, yes, it's unfortunate. Yes, more needs to be invested in security and awareness, etc. But the transparency of the blockchain is something that really, there's no direct analog in TradFi. And so, while these are issues to be worked through along the lines of the issues we work through in Web 2, it certainly empowers stakeholders in a way that we might not have had as recently as 10 years ago.
Yeah. And it's also, maybe a lot of people don't think about this. Skeptics and I think it's good to be a skeptic and to be a critic, right? Because we have to remain honest. A lot of people don't think about how regulating a space more, entering firms into the regulatory perimeter, having clear rules, that actually is a strategy to minimize some of the illicit activity because you have an environment where there are certain rules. And honestly, when there are more rules, right, more of the scammy stuff and the illicit stuff has to either go away or it's harder for it to survive. I think a lot about, this is very real. Like one of the biggest things, and I know your reports have shown this in recent years, scams are some of the biggest portion or has has often been one of the biggest portions of illicit transactions, right? Scams that are happening.
Yeah.
It's huge. And
there's explosive growth in fraud and scams. And, when I talked about the Hexagate and Alteria acquisitions, that's a part of it. But certainly those threat actors are leveraging AI. I would encourage our listeners to check out the scam section of the Crypto Crime Report. But precisely those following, those actors, regulators, policymakers, public and private sector, can also use technology to, as you say, to take a little bit of the oxygen out of that ecosystem.
Yeah, and also thinking about the victims when they're getting caught up. One of the reasons why these are so prevalent is because of all the activity happening in unregulated spaces. So let me just give like a couple of personal
Please.
anecdotes. I mean, just people that I know, people close to me who I've known for years. In the past year, have reached out. Family members have reached out because they have been involved in these crypto investment groups, and so they started to tell me about them. And one of the things that they would say,
we're an audio podcast, but for our listeners, both of our eyebrows are raised right now.
Yeah, let me tell you what they would say. Yeah, so I got into this crypto investment group, and it happens on WhatsApp, and all of the conversation on WhatsApp, and they're talking about investment, and in my mind I'm like, no, wait a second. A legitimate, investment company is not going to be sharing. They're not going to have their main activity and outreach to investors in WhatsApp. Just a lot of reasons. Because you can't do that with your customers, etc. That is an indicator that something is wrong. This may not be a legitimate investment. It's probably a scam. But the reason is, we have to have more regulated spaces. And then the people who are interested, they know where to go. So we should embrace regulation for what it can do to keep people from being victims, to providing a sort of a safe place. Now, there's always going to be the underground. I'm not saying get rid of the underground, but again, when a lot of, the mainstream, the people that we know and love, our folks are just going to whatever because of the lack of guardrails, then that's an issue.
Right, absolutely. A little bit of action would go a long way, I think, in terms of shrinking the attack surface, or at least making it harder for threat actors. Well, this has been an awesome conversation. I think before we drop, I feel a little bit like Daniel interviewing Mr. Miyagi here. Can you tell our listeners about your podcast work, not only with Illicit Edge, but also the Jabari Lincoln Files, and a little bit about that, what you focus on, how you came to that, and where they can listen to your content?
Yeah. I'll start with most recently. So I teamed up with the Illicit Edge Media Network, which has a newsletter on financial crime. Great for folks to subscribe there. Daily newsletter on illicit finance. We started a podcast on illicit finance called Designated, which I host, and it's about financial crime fighters. And we've talked to quite a few folks that deal with crypto. We had Erin West with pig butchering on there.
She's great. Yeah. Ian Andrews, who was our previous host, he interviewed her. She's terrific.
Yeah, we had an episode where we talked to one of the undercover agents who brought down the Silk Road, which is up in the news for a lot of reasons today.
Yes.
But Designated, it's about the stories behind fighting financial crime, and so folks can find that on their podcast or on YouTube. It's also a video on YouTube. And before I started doing Designated, I had a podcast. I did season 1 of a podcast called the Jabari Lincoln Files. It is a spy thriller with a crypto fintech theme. It's an audio spy thriller that I put in a podcast format, and from what people have told me, it's very cinematic. It's not like just an audio book. It is a cinematic story.
Move over, Jack Ryan. Right.
Move over, Jack Ryan, I hope. It's and so it has a protagonist who's a CIA analyst who gets caught up in an interesting global financial conspiracy. So folks can find that as well on there, wherever they get their podcasts.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that, and thank you for this terrific conversation. Looking forward to feedback on the episode. I'm sure there will be some.
Absolutely. Great to be with you. You all are doing great work, and thanks to you and to your audience.
Awesome.
Take care.
Yaya is a powerhouse on digital assets and national security and policy. One of the areas he covered was financial crime concerns in conflict zones. On April 2nd, OFAC sanctioned a network of financial and logistical facilitators tied to the Iran-backed Houthis. OFAC identified 8 crypto wallets used to support the Houthis' weapons, commodities procurement, and sanctions evasion activity. The network includes Russia-based actors and shipping companies, and has facilitated the movement of arms, stolen grain from Ukraine, and millions of dollars in illicit payments in support of the Houthis' destabilizing activity. Head down to the show notes to read the full blog and see how the Houthis operate, review on-chain activity of the designated addresses, and understand what this means for the fight against terrorist financing connected to crypto. Remember, if you learned something from this podcast, feel free to share with a colleague or friend. You subscribing and sharing this podcast allows us to get some of the biggest guests in the industry and share their knowledge with the audience.